All the way here?
Right there, yes.
Okay, and can I wander here?
Yep.
I'm right here, so I can wander some. Okay, so Marilynne Robinson's Housekeeping, her first book, and I don't think her greatest book, but I think this is a great book. What this book primarily concerns is something that is very similar to what Cather talks about in one of ours. And that is, it concerns living a life without a backdrop. Living in a political community that does not have the cohesiveness to tell a story about life. So each individual must then try to come up with something on his own. Cather talked about this in a positive sense, about such a backdrop being necessary for a good life. In one of ours, you're in a bad spot there. This is in one of ours, for those with the favorite numbering, page 328. When David reflects while sitting with Gerhardt, or excuse me, while Claude reflects while sitting with David Gerhardt, life was so short, David writes or thought, that it meant nothing unless it were continually reinforced by something that endured, unless the shadows of individual existence came and went against a background that held together. So individual existence comes to have meaning when it is infused into someone with your mother's milk. Which is to say, if we were all bereft constantly and had to answer every question about life on our own, it's difficult to actually come to conclusions. Living in a society that provides ready-made answers to some primordial questions about life, cultivates human thriving and human happiness. And the thought that Cather gives is that modern America fails to provide such a backdrop, fails to provide such a horizon. Hence, modern America is inconsistent with human thriving and happiness. We see much the same story in the beginning of Housekeeping. For those with a favorite numbering, and hopefully that's most of us, we have some reflections on Grandma. We see that the psychological problem that Grandma has is also the psychological problem that her family has. This is on page 25, we read this in discussion group the other day. Grandma, seemed distracted and absent-minded. It was in fact, I think, that she was aware of too many things, having no principle for selecting the more from the less important, and that her awareness could never be diminished, since it was among the things she had thought of as familiar that this disaster had taken shape. So Grandma, too, lacks a horizon that helps her distinguish the important from the unimportant, the fleeting from the permanent, a good answer from a bad answer, and this leads to a kind of confusion in the way she educates her children. In other words, what both Cather and Robinson diagnose in the modern world is an absence of what Plato might call poets, or a poverty of what we would call education. When you ask an American, what is the purpose of education? There is no genuine answer. Americans cannot answer the question, education toward what? This is the confusion of our age. And it's the confusion that only the Stones, that is, the family of, that we are looking at in housekeeping, recognizes. They live in this confusion. One of the things that Robinson, so I think this is the problem that Robinson states, is the reason, the setting, the intellectual setting of this book. The physical setting, of course, is here in the West. The intellectual setting is a confused age, an age without horizon. And what Robinson seeks to do in this book, and I actually think she does it rather beautifully, is she seeks to evoke or to educate us about the mysteries of life and how those mysteries of life lie right there before us. We will just take the time to see them. She uses the most commonplace things. This book is about housekeeping. She uses the most commonplace things to show us what the genuine mysteries of life are. Some people just see a lake. But Robinson sees more than a lake. She sees baptism, floods, burial grounds, all things that she likens to the lake in this book. Some people look and they see trees. In the woods, Robinson sees lost civilizations. She sees dead people. Some people look and they see just another body, another human being. She insists on seeing spirits and ghosts and presumably souls as well. She's always trying to elevate the common in this book, so she can build a backdrop. So she can show how the common things in life support a larger picture that helps us to answer the primordial questions of life. She seeks to be the poet of Plato's cave. Now, how does this work itself out in the book? Well, what I want to do today is talk first about the characters, and then try to defend the incompetence of Sylvie and Ruth, I think the two main characters of the book. So let's talk first about the characters. The way this plot unfolds reminds us, as we talked about last time, of the biblical Book of Ruth, the first words of the story, right? Or My Name is Ruth. And in interviews that Robinson has done ex cathedra, she likens and talks about how Ruth was the inspiration for the character Ruth. Now, I'm not going to get into all the nitty-gritty of the story of Ruth, but one of the questions of the Book of Ruth is, who should Ruth follow? She leaves her homeland, goes and lives with her husband dies, but she stays with her mother-in-law afterward and follows her. And things end up working out all right for Ruth. On the advice of her mother-in-law, Naomi, if I remember right, she goes and sleeps next to a very important man, Boaz. Have I got that right? And Boaz, quite taken with the fetching young lady, proposes marriage. They have children. And the child of Ruth and Boaz ends up being the father of Jesse, who is, I believe, the father of David. Not that I really know what I'm talking about, but I think that's correct. It's been a long time since I read Ruth. So who is Ruth to follow? Is one of the questions of the Book of Ruth, and she follows Naomi, and ultimately that works out. Well, who is Ruth to follow in this book? It's a battle for the soul of Ruth. And the contenders, the realistic contenders for the soul of Ruth, are Lucille and Sylvie. This is the path that lays before this character. The battle for Ruth happens in 3 parts. Chapters 1 through 3 are Ruth's narrative of the family history and dynamics. Chapters 4 through 7 shows us Lucille and Ruth drifting apart after the arrival of Sylvie. In chapters 8 through 11, that is, 8 through the conclusion, Ruth transforms into Sylvie's role and calls Sylvie her mother. So what's it? So I mean, I think that's how the book itself is organized. What do these characters mean? What do they stand for? Why are they important? Let's first of all take a look at their names. I think we've already talked about Ruth for a second. Lucille. Lucille comes from the Latin word meaning bright, sunshine. Sylvia comes from the Latin word silva, meaning, of course, woods or forest. And please correct me if I'm wrong. Which is a dark and dank place. Now, I'm not positive, or I shouldn't say it like that. So let's look at the character Lucille first. Bright, sunshine, Lucille. What does she stand for? What does she mean? While I don't want to entirely sound like Sigmund Freud the rest of my life, I'm going to use one sentence that sounds like Sigmund Freud for once. Lucille seems to stand for the reality principle. That's actually what they say, kind of. Page 93. Last paragraph on page 93. So did I, because I found, as Lucille changed, advantage in conforming my attitudes towards hers. She was of the common persuasion. Time had not yet come, or had not come yet. An anomaly in itself had the fiercest reality for her. So she stands for a kind of reality. And as we see, she ultimately leaves the family and joins the city of Fingerbone. What does reality mean for Lucille? We talked about this once again a bit in discussion group, but I think it's a very American reality. She stands for self-improvement, understood as an American would understand it. She's willing to forget the past or to reinvent the past in order to have a more positive attitude about it. So as Robinson begins to compare and contrast Lucille to Ruth, the first thing that she brings up is their attitude or remembrance of their mother. we looked at this once again in a discussion group. I don't have the page number written down here, but it goes something like this. When Lucille thinks of her mother, she thinks of someone who accidentally drove over a cliff. My mother would not abandon me. My mother loved me. That is a life-giving lie. Much better not to feel abandoned, much better to feel loved. And she convinces herself of that truth. And from that standpoint, from that point of view, she can embrace this quest for improvement. She becomes disgusted with the way Sylvie keeps the house, the sloppiness of it, the bad food, the lack of respectability. She makes friends outside the family. First with the young girl, Rosette Brown, who's only mentioned and not really introduced, the fine young lady who takes ballet lessons, or some kind of dancing, I can't remember what. Not pole dancing, but it was some kind of dancing. She ultimately wants to go to school so that she can find a place in the community. She is mortified at the accusation of cheating. She accepts the community's standards. That's what Lucille does. And it becomes clear that she is not going to be able to adhere to that community standard by continuing to live with her family. So ultimately, when all of her plans of self-improvement and making dresses with her family fail, she goes and lives with the home ec teacher. And what Ruth writes, this is on page 140, and I'm just going to paraphrase, but I think this is the quote. And from that moment on, I no longer had a sister. And it's genuinely true, it seems, that Sylvie does stand in the way of Lucille's self-improvement as understood by the people of Fingerbone. She wants to improve herself. She needs to assimilate herself to the community, and that requires a rejection of Sylvie and Ruth. And from that point on, they don't seem to ever have any more contact with one another. What I'm trying to get at here is Lucille stands for, I'm just going to say something like respectable middle-class morality. Which requires a certain denial of the past or suppression of it. And an optimistic or hopeful gloss on the future. She wants to live in Boston. A girl's got a dream. And no matter how pitiful it is, that's hers. Now, I don't know that Ruth ever gives an argument against going in this direction. And it's really incumbent upon us to figure out why Ruth rejects the way of Lucille. And I think the best way to do that is to figure out why Ruth ends up hanging with Sylvie. Soon after Ruth says, I have no longer a sister, she says, this is page 145 of Sylvie, we are the same. She has found a kind of soulmate in Sylvie. But we need to find that, because there are differences between the two. So now we're considering Sylvie. Let's consider Sylvie for a second. Sylvie never seems to have gotten over the death of her father. I think she lives haunted by it. Always kind of looking to the past. The source of stability for her life, her sisters, her family, was rocked very early. She never enjoys it. She has always lived the life of a transient. It's of course later on Sylvie who's willing to burn down the house that Grandma had said was the only source of stability. Although I think the novel shows that it's not that stable. She's haunted by death. But I think she's haunted by the death of the past. That is, deaths that have happened in the past. She does not get over it. She does not ever really seem to get over the wrongs. And maybe this is annoying. It's certainly inconsistent with the middle-class, stiff upper lip view of the world, right? She is not going to get over the wrongs that have been committed, the wrongs that she has endured. She never gets over it. Which means that she's really never capable of doing anything. She dwells more on that past than is probably healthy from a modern middle-class American point of view. I often think how different my life would be if when my daughter had cancer, if she would, and was on death's door for a long time, if she would have died. It's a lot easier to get up in the morning when they live. But that's not how it happened with Sylvie. The father went right over. The sisters left. They were weird. But they were weird because they couldn't forget. Now, I don't think that's how Ruth is, although I think Ruth is very much concerned about death. I think Ruth is kind of a forward-looking thinker, a forward-looking character. She has a lot of images. And the closer she gets to Sylvie, the more she gets lost in reveries. We're going to look at some of them in a little bit. But she's a dreamer, and she says that she has a difficult time distinguishing what's real from what's a product of the imagination. She has a difficult time distinguishing what is alive from what is dead. She calls death the only true birth, page 162. She is fascinated in a very interesting passage. She shows fascination with the fate of Carthage and this imagined lost civilization in the woods. She imagines that lost civilization would be something like this. Carthage, after it had been sown with salt so nothing could grow there, eventually the salt would wear away after thousands of years and things would be able to grow. And how would they grow? They would look like this. This is life built on the basis of ruins, but it too will ultimately die. So she's fascinated with ruins, even as she's seeing new life. This is the kind of person, I wear someone's clothes that's a little bit like this, this is the kind of person who sees dead people. By which I mean recognizes that everyone and everything around will eventually fall apart and wither away, and seeks to find her way in a world that is constantly perishing. So I think what Sylvie and Ruth share is an appreciation for mortality, and how that appreciation will shape their view or vista on life. This is not Hemingway, who seems to recognize that the fact that we all die alone is a fundamental truth of the human condition. I mean, I think it is a fundamental truth of the human condition and should shape how we think. But neither of them, I should say, both of them have a sort of pity or compassion about those facts that is utterly lacking in Hemingway. Ruth looks forward and sees everything that is alive will die. Sylvie looks backward and sees that everything that has happened up to this point has been tinged with the sadness of death. So let's make no mistake about it, okay? It's a frustrating novel. Ruth and Sylvie are incompetent human beings. Sylvie should not be in charge of Ruth. She's a horrible mother. From any respectable middle-class point of view, this is a tragedy that Sylvie is in charge of Ruth. After Lucille leaves, they go out for a night on the lake, they hop on the train, they come back home, the cops are there. Where have you been? Oh, I promise we're going to try to do a little better in the future. The old ladies of town come over with their casseroles, and they criticize the way Sylvia has been keeping house. And what does she do? She seeks to mend her ways. She seeks to become more like the respectable middle-class people of the town. But the sheriff comes back. That's not good enough. That attempt at housekeeping, at improved housekeeping, is not enough. And it's pretty clear that the next day, the sheriff is going to take Ruth away. And as I say, from any respectable middle-class point of view, this makes perfect sense. Sylvie is an incompetent parent. You should close doors. Occasionally, consider making something besides graham crackers. You should send your kids to school. But this is not a normal family, and perhaps the respectable middle-class point of view isn't the right point of view. Sylvie and Ruth, as we know, devise a plan, and that is a plan to escape the influence of the community. They're going to burn down the house and escape. Now, actually, I want to read a passage here. This is at the end of 9, I believe. I need a maybe it's at the end of 8, I'm sorry. Here we go, it's at the end of 8. This is when they return from the lake. This is kind of a remarkable little thing. Page 174, near the top. So after they had hopped on the train, come back home, after spending a couple days out on the lake and having some very strange experiences, they're really all about what had happened in the past and what could happen in the future. Sylvie is reliving the haunted days of her father going over the the bridge, the Fireball Express, Cannonball Express, whatever it is, going into the lake and everyone disappearing. And imagining all of the people who were dead in this lake. Of course, how does Ruth respond to that? When she drinks water, she wonders, how much of my mother is in here? How much of the people from the Fireball is in this water? It actually comes from the lake. And so every time she's confronted with water, she thinks about the death of countless people in that lake. But they return. And very interesting here. When we were at home finally, Sylvie made a fire and we sat by the stove. Sylvie found graham crackers and Cheerios, but we were too tired to eat. So she patted my head and went off to a room to lie down. I was almost asleep, or I was asleep, and the difference would seem to matter. All right? I was either awake or asleep. When Lucille came into the kitchen and sat down in Sylvie's chair, she did not say anything. She pulled up one foot to retie her sneaker and looked around the kitchen, and then she said, "I wish you'd take off your coat. My clothes are wet. You should change your clothes." I was too tired to move. She brought some wood from the porch and dropped it into the stove. "It doesn't matter," Lucille said. "Where have you been?" Now I would have told Lucille, and I meant to tell her as soon as I composed my thoughts, and I began to say, to the lake, to the bridge. But I felt warmly that Lucille deserved a much better answer. I wished very much, in fact, to tell Lucille exactly where I had been, and it was precisely my sense of the importance of telling her this that put me to sleep. For I dreamed and dreamed that Sylvie and I were drifting in the dark and did not know where we were, or that Sylvie knew and would not tell me. I dreamed that the bridge was a chute into the lake, and that one after another, handsome trains slid into the water without troubling the surface. I dreamed that the bridge was a frame of a charred house, and that Sylvie and I were looking for children who lived there. And though we had heard them, we could never find them. I dreamed that Sylvie was teaching me to walk underwater. To move more slowly needed patience and grace, but she pulled after me in the slowest waltz, and our clothes flew like the robes of painted angel. It seemed Lucille was talking to me. I think she said I need not stay with Sylvie. I believe she mentioned my comfort. She was pinching a crease into the loose denim at the knee of her jeans, and her brow was contracted and her eyes were calm, and I am sure she spoke to me in all sober kindness, but I could not hear a word she said. That has come from completely different worlds and concerns. Lucille, this imagined Lucille, I think of her dreams as concerned with comfort and the crease of the jeans. Ruth is concerned about something utterly unreal. Dancing underwater. Trains going into the water without disturbing the surface. These are her reveries. I don't think Lucille is there. I think this is one of her dreams, but once again, she can't tell the reality from her dreams. She says that explicitly in a bit more. So they decide to leave. They try to keep a normal house. After this, the sheriff comes, the old lady comes. They can't reform themselves. They try to leave the house. They try to lead normal housekeeping, it doesn't work. They decide to burn down the house, escape over the bridge, and live life of transience. Now, it's not exactly clear what happens. Once again, in a novel where the narrator cannot distinguish reality from visions, it is not clear whether they actually survive the run across the bridge. She says she fell a couple times and stumbled, and that meant certain death. But then, of course, we do have the book, which describes what happens afterward, although it wouldn't be beyond Robinson or any other author to use such a strange literary device as to continue to use the same narrator after the narrator's dead. For someone that cannot well distinguish between life and death, having a narrator continue to live after death makes perfect sense. So it is not, I should say, clear whether Sylvie and Ruth survive. But here's what I want to try to accomplish now. These are frustrating characters. They are incompetent characters. Sylvie should not be entrusted with raising Ruth or anyone else. And Ruth herself should get a respectable education. That, no doubt, is what some people think when they're reading this, and some source of frustration. But what I want to do is defend their incompetence, which is, I think, the object that Robinson sets for herself. Their incompetence is truer to life, properly reflects a tragic sense of loss, only these incompetent characters are willing to look at life and find something real. They see souls or ghosts. So we really need to talk about, what does it mean to be real? What does it mean to be realistic? What is reality? And what I think Robinson is up to in the book is attempting to show that the view that is seen in Sylvie and Ruth is more true to our nature than the view seen in normal middle-class life, as figured here in Fingerbone. The life of the transient